Okay, good afternoon. I have 1:30 and we're still expecting, a lot more people to sign on, but we're all here, so we're going to get started. You are here for Shade Gardening Beyond Hosta. I'm Martha Smith, Horticulture Educator, and I am located up in the Rock Island, Henry Mercer Rock Island and Stark counties. And today, with our webinar series, we're going to be talking about shade gardening. The information that you were sent, you have a handout. You could either print it out as 3 slides per page or 6 slides per page. But I realized I had a lot of pictures, and some people don't like to print out all that colored ink. So there was a third alternative. You don't need all 3, but the third is just a simple plant list where, when we get into the plants, it lists them all. So for those of you that just don't want all the color pictures, you can print that one out, or you can actually print out the whole program. So, shade gardening. I'm assuming that you all are signed on today because you're dealing with shade somewhere in your property. Because shade is part of almost every home landscape, and it offers interesting and challenging plant possibilities. But when you really think about it, what is shade? It's not just a black and white subject, because it changes. It changes throughout the day. It changes throughout the year. I mean, look at your garden, and plants may be shaded in the morning, but get the full intense rays in the afternoon. Or the reverse, maybe they're getting the morning sun and the afternoon shade. And then think about time of year. The angles of the sun change with the seasons. So what you're seeing shaded now, when you go out in your garden in July, could be getting more sun. And people often think of shade coming from a tree. But realize you also have shade coming from buildings, from permanent structures, and also a plant within your garden can be casting shade onto a plant right next to it. So it really is an interesting subject. Shade gardening is not going to be that full sun border that you see on the front of Better Homes and Gardens. If you put those plants into your shade situation, one of you is not going to be happy. The plants won't bloom well, they'll flop, they might stretch. So you need to work with foliage textures, foliage color, plant size, plant shape. Here I'm showing you a shade garden. This was on the north side of my house, and this garden received absolutely no direct sun. It faced direct north. And over here, I'm going to try to use my little marker. This was the east corner, but there was a huge spruce. So this never received any direct sunlight. But it was a bright area, and we're going to talk about different degrees of shade. So what I was working with was sizes and shapes and textures, and working with perennials and blooms and annuals. And that's what you need to think about when you're working with shade. So what is shade? Well, wherever there's light, you're going to have a shadow. And as long as the sun shines, anything that moves, be it man, animal, or machine, it's going to have its shadow. Large objects block the sun, and this casts shade. But shade, it's an elusive subject, and by definition, it just means lower levels of light. In a garden situation, this means lower levels of sunlight. What it is not is full sun. There are levels of shade, and these levels vary from morning to sunset, and sunny days versus cloudy days, and with passing seasons. But nature, she has an important lesson for us, and one of the most important is to copy what we see in nature. Where were these plants naturally found growing? The plants we're going to talk about today, when they were discovered growing in lower light situations, not full sun, thus they were given the name shade plants. But there are varying levels of shade. This was a definition that I found in The Complete Shade Gardener by George Schenk. And it's how much shade for a plant?
The answer depends on the weight and measure of a shifting non-substance that varies in intensity. I mean, really think about that. It's the weight and measure of a shifting, it's a non-substance, and it varies in intensity. So I thought that was a really interesting definition. Now we have types of shade. We have levels of shade. There's usually 4 that are recognized: light shade, medium shade, full shade, heavy, or dense. And often they're lumped into this very elusive category called partial shade. So we're going to talk a little bit about each type, and you have to determine what your situation is. Every one of you is dealing with a different shade situation. What plants grow in what type? Well, let Mother Nature be your guide, and take a walk in the woods or take a walk in an established woodland garden and notice what is growing, but also notice what isn't growing. The first one we have is light shade, and this is usually an open area where sun-shade patterns are going to move continually over the plants. Usually a high, thin canopy of trees, so there's a brightness to the area. Or it could be you've created a structure like a shade lath over the top. Some definitions will put this as considerable amounts of direct sunlight, but no midday sun. So you're getting shade midday. Other books will define it as 3 to 4 hours of shade over that one growing day period. And really, the light shade, you have your greatest possibilities for planting and plant qualities. Medium shade, we're just increasing the hours of shade. Now we have 4 to 6 hours of shade. Maybe now you're getting more shade in the morning or more shade in the afternoon. Could be caused by trees or buildings obstructing otherwise bright sun. Sometimes you hear the term dappled shade, and it's really very vague because sometimes people will call light shade dappled shade. So I think you're realizing it's very hard to pinpoint specific definitions. Full shade is totally shaded all day with no direct sun. Maybe some reflected light. Maybe something that's being coming in from a building, shining off the side of a building. But usually full shade is the north side. It's under fully leafed out trees, things like beech and maples and oaks and some of our evergreens. Heavy or dense shade is a very deep shade. This is no direct sun. Now we're talking about being obstructed by a structure, maybe a deck or a porch, or some of our low-limbed evergreens. We're also in this situation dealing with dry situations, and dry shade is a very challenging planting site. But we're going to talk about the soil situations. Then we get this term partial shade. And that seems to be one of the more common definitions. It can run the gamut from light shade to medium shade, and it's really difficult to distinguish partial shade from partial sun. Most horticultural references are going to list full sun as 6 or more hours of direct sunlight a day. That's 6 hours or more. It's not reflected or dappled. This is 6 or more hours. Does it have to be 6 continuous? No. It could be 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours late afternoon. On the other side, shade, most horticultural references are going to define it as less than 2 hours of sunlight a day. Now, partial sun is when your location leans closer to a full sun situation, say 4 to 6 hours of sun. Partial shade, it's going to lean closer to that shade definition, so 2 to 4 hours. But it's very difficult, and I tell people you have to go out and you have to determine your situation. Go out in your garden, go out at 6 in the morning, 8, 10, noon, 2, 4, 6. That's what's going to tell you. Not only do it in May, but also go out in July and see how the angle of the sun has changed in your garden. Now, a lot of times people will say, well, I'm looking up a plant in a book or a catalog or online, and it says full sun to partial shade. So which is it? Well, industry standard, the plant prefers the first, but will tolerate the second. So full sun to partial shade would mean the best display you could anticipate in full sun, but you could get a good display in partial shade. So we have changes in shade. It changes throughout the year and varies with location. Midday sun in Florida is going to be more intense than in Alaska. However, in our northern locations, the duration of sunlight is longer, so plants compensate for the lack of intensity by having a longer period of sunlight. The time of year we already talked about. What's the angle of the sun during May and then in July? Also your trees and shrubs, when you plant them and they mature, their branches are going to spread and they're going to envelop more space, creating potentially more and deeper shade. And as this happens, some plants, depending on the type of plant, might be able to adapt to the lower light situation. It might just, maybe not bloom as much or maybe have smaller foliage, where others might stretch and flop over because they're trying to reach that sunlight. And another thing when you're gardening, and I know this is a challenge, consider the effects of what you're doing today. Think of what it's going to be 10, 20, 50 years down the road. Now this is tough and you might think, oh, that's kind of unrealistic, but keep in mind plants will grow and spread. If you are going to be in your location for many, many years, you might seriously consider, do I want that 80-foot tree, or do I want a 30-foot tree, or do I want a 20-foot bush versus an 8-foot bush? Or if you don't care, just plant away, and someone years from now when they're working in that area will probably either be cursing you or thanking you. I think someone's going to probably be cursing me in my yard in about 20 to 30 years. The time of day. The heat and drying capabilities of afternoon sun is detrimental to most shade plants, and morning shade, afternoon sun just doesn't provide enough cooling in the afternoon unless you have ample soil moisture. Soil moisture, some plants that are listed as a shade plant, if they're growing in a sunnier situation, if they're provided with ample soil moisture, can perform very well. During the day, as the sun as it goes through the day, the sun's strength increases, and plants have to cool off, and they do this through transpiration. And as long as there is ample soil moisture, certain plants are able to tolerate it. Some plants are not. So really determines the type of the plant. The older the plant might have more of an established root system that can tolerate those different situations. But think of transpiration as a plant cooling off, just as you and I, when we're outside to cool off, we have perspiration. So let's talk a little bit more about this shifting non-substance that varies in intensity. I just love that definition of shade. Most gardeners are facing a situation where they want to modify their sun situation to grow favored plants, and they're going to put them in a situation where they normally wouldn't grow. So let's look at an area that maybe you're dealing with, it's too shaded, and you want more plants, you want a greater variety of plants. Can you do any thinning out? Can you thin out any of the overhead branches, or can you the surrounding shrubs? Can you get the angles of the sun to come in either morning or afternoon? Limb the trees up. If you have a very dense canopy, can you remove some of the lower limbs to create that open air space, that more of a bright shade underneath? You might have to take out some plants, you might have to take out some trees, and that's always something you want to seriously consider, because when you take those out, you want to make sure that you're not harming any of the other plants around them. Or maybe you want to increase your shade. I had a shade garden many years ago, and Mother Nature came through with a very strong windstorm and wiped out all our large trees. So I went from a very shaded situation to a full sun situation. So maybe you want to create shade. So do you want to create a lath or some type of structure overhead to provide that necessary shade for certain plants? Shade plants usually require similar growing conditions to their full sun counterparts. They all need a nice, loose, highly organic soil with good drainage. In a shade situation, most, and you can't see me, but I'm using my little air finger quotes when I say most, of our shaded areas are not going to dry out as quickly as the full sun garden counterparts. Full sun, the penetrating heat is going to cause the soil to dry out more versus a shade situation. If you're dealing with shade and if you're dealing with clay, then you've got the poor drainage on top of that. So you might want to amend your soil. You might want to add compost or aged manure. If your shade is created by a building, then you're not going to be dealing with competing tree and shrub roots. So usually when it's a building shade, we tend to have soil that doesn't dry out as quickly as soil when we're planting under existing trees. So again, wherever you're growing. Now, building a shade garden under existing trees can be a touchy issue because you really don't want to go in and disturb that tree's root system. But sometimes it's the only alternative if that's the only spot you have. You want to minimize the amount of digging and rototilling around established trees so you don't have further injury down the road. Heavy equipment can damage roots, and you might consider working in various locations over a course of a year or two so that you're not just coming in and working in one huge area. Maybe you could work in it in sections if you're concerned about some of the plant material. Plants are going to let you know. Some plants might take some time to adapt to a particular location, and some will tell you right away. If it's too much sun, they can get crispy. They can get a sunburn, a discoloration to their leaves. Others, like I said, will grow tall and spindly. They'll flop over. Maybe you're going to get smaller flowers if you get any flowers at all. And some plants, actually some of our hostas, if they're grown in too deep of shade, can actually lose their variegation. Now, care of a shade plant can be different than those in full sun. We were just talking about similar growing conditions, but now let's talk about care. As you know, as gardeners, every plant has its own special needs. So I try to plant in groups of plants that share similar requirements. So if I know those that like moist situations, well, I'm going to put those together in an area where I know my soil will hold more moisture. Or if I have those that tend to do better in a dry situation, I'm going to plant those together. And remember, most shady gardens won't dry out as quickly as the same garden in a full sun situation. So your watering might have to be adjusted. Here I'm showing you a situation where the hostas were pocket planted underneath an established red maple. That's where the gardener dug out areas in between the major roots to pocket plant these hostas because I didn't want to go in and disturb the major root system. Well, you're bringing in a nice medium, some compost, you're planting your hostas in that pocket. But now, guess what? The tree roots are going to say, ooh, that's nice soil. There's a lot of moisture. They're going to start growing in, and they're going to start to compete. So for the first year, year and a half, you might then have to pocket water. So you have to really watch those situations until those plants are established enough, they've anchored their roots, and will be able to compete. It's always difficult to tell someone how to water their garden. Everyone's situation is different. A general rule, for many of you have heard this, is an inch of water every 7 to 10 days during the growing season. You know your site better. Go out and check. You want a moisture retentive soil, but you don't want it soggy. Now, realize that in a shade situation, especially if you're growing under the canopy of trees and shrubs, those canopies can actually serve as umbrellas, and the water will actually be dripping off and shed out near the drip line. And people really don't think about this. They think, oh, we got a half an inch of rain, that should be fine. Well, set a rain gauge out in your shade garden and see how much water actually penetrated through that canopy and reached that shade area underneath. I think you'll be surprised. Now, the past couple days, we've had quite a lot of rain, and I'm pretty sure it penetrated through the canopy. But in the summer growing season, that half inch might not have reached down and watered the plants as thoroughly as you thought. We always recommend watering in the morning. This allows the foliage to dry off during the day. Foliage that goes into nightfall is often prone to more fungal diseases and problems. Fertilizing, you don't want to over-fertilize your shade plants. You don't want to push a lot of soft succulent growth because that's just going to need more moisture. That's going to keep it upright. I feed my soil. I work in organic matter, aged manures, compost. So I'm feeding my soil every time I'm adding, every time I'm dividing, and I will also top dress with a compost. And you don't want to over-fertilize. It can push too much growth, and some plants can lose their variegation. And this can happen with hostas. Some people have had hostas. With too much nitrogen, they've lost some of the white or yellow variegation. Problems, well, shade gardens have their own set of problems. We already talked about the soil situations, dry soil or soil that doesn't dry out as quickly. There are weeds, though most weeds prefer a sunny situation, except creeping Charlie, or you might call it ground ivy. It seems to thrive in either situation. You also might see more weeds in the spring before your deciduous trees leaf out, because the sun is able to reach down and warm the soil and get the seeds to germinate. So you might see some chickweed, you might have some dandelions, but usually in a shade situation, possibly some oxalis and ground ivy seem to be the main two. Slugs are a problem in a shade garden, especially if you have hostas. They thrive in moist, shady conditions, and their damage usually manifests itself with raspy holes, and usually you can see a slime trail. I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. People don't see them because they're nocturnal. They feed at night, and during the day they're going to be underneath mulch or debris in your garden. So you might want to clean up your garden if you have a windstorm or if you have some branches or if you have places during the day where they could hide. Control can be challenging. You might want to, like I said, clean up your garden or check some of these places where they might be hiding, maybe underneath a statue or something set in your garden. And there's various baits and traps that you can use, but whatever you choose, do follow all the label instructions. Moss is a common problem, and it's usually associated with poor drainage, compacted soil, or an improper soil pH. And it can be difficult to control without taking some drastic measures. Maybe you have to aerate that spot, or maybe you want to prune out some upper branches to try to get a better airflow, or maybe some more sunlight, or you might need to change the pH. I personally like moss in my garden. I find it very attractive, and there are people that are actually cultivating it, and really it's pretty maintenance free. So here's slug damage, just the raspy holes and often kind of a slime trail. So we've talked about the garden itself. Now let's talk about plants. Shade plants come in all shapes, sizes, and forms, and there's annuals, there's perennials. But when we think of perennials, a lot of people don't think of, all the different types, bulbs and wildflowers, ferns, ground covers, ornamental grasses. And then we do have woody ornamentals that can tolerate shade. Today our talk is going to concentrate on perennials. Just to show you some common annuals that you might encounter, I've got impatiens, begonias, caladiums, coleus, heliotrope. These are the ones that we replace every year. They're the annuals. But today we're going to talk about all of the perennials that you see listed on these two slides. But before we begin, I had to address hostas, because so often hosta is kind of like the gateway plant. Gateway drug to get us into gardening, especially with shade gardening, because they're so easy to grow. There's a multitude of sizes, shapes, colors, and leaf patterns. There's now some that are more sun tolerant. Yellow types usually can tolerate more sun. I'm showing you my garden there. That's one called Sun Power. I think if you look and find ones that have something like sun or solar in their name, usually a good hint that they're going to be able to tolerate more sunlight. This one would get sun from morning up until about 4 in the afternoon. Blue types prefer medium to full shade, but there's so many to choose from. But today we're going to go beyond hostas and talk about some more unusual shade-loving plants. The first on the list is bear's breeches. And I realize today, there's people listening from southern Illinois to northern Illinois and also from many surrounding states. So I'm trying to cover plants that cover primarily the growing zones of Illinois. So from the southern point, from a little bit of zone 6B, 7, going up to Wisconsin, which just gets up into almost zone 4. Acanthus bear's breeches, there's about 4 or 5 species that are in the trade. This is the spiny bear's breeches. Great foliage. If you look at it, it's got a really kind of almost like a thistle-like look. Then it sends up these beautiful purple spikes, very statuesque. I planted this in my garden 20-some years ago. At the time, it said it wasn't hardy for me. I'm still dealing with acanthus in my garden. So it does have an underground rhizome. It can spread, especially in a moist situation, and it seems to be doing very well in my zone 5. There's another acanthus that those of you in southern Illinois might be able to grow, and that's mollis, acanthus mollis. It has a different leaf, similar type flower, and that's one that we definitely can't grow in northern Illinois. The actias, these are nice, and I added these to my garden last year. I'm showing you the white baneberry, I'm showing you red baneberry, and then I'm actually showing you black cohosh, and some of you might be very surprised to see that listed as actea. I am following Alan Armitage's research, and it is now listed as actea and not semicifuga. Alba is white baneberry, sometimes called doll's eyes. It has a nice lush foliage, and it gets these bright white berries that persist for about 4 to 6 weeks going into late summer, early fall. Most references will list it between 2.5 to 3 feet tall. The red baneberry, it also is another showplace because it offers a nice attractive white flower in the spring, and then it gets the red berries, and also about 3 feet tall. What's nice is that neither of these are spring ephemerals, and a spring ephemeral is going to bloom in the spring and then die down in the summer. So you have the baneberries for the entire growing season, and the berries persist going into summer, into fall. Now the black cohosh, which used to be semicifuga, is a tall woodland plant. It has these candle-like spires of white flowers. Can really be a very impressive specimen in the garden, easily reaching 5 to 6 feet tall. It's got deep green foliage, comes into bloom in about mid to, in my garden it comes into July usually, and usually has a nice bloom for about 3.5 weeks. moist situation, though, if it has a dry spot, it could turn to a little bit of a crispy critter. Ajuga, and some of you are very familiar with growing Ajuga. It's a common ground cover. I'm just showing you some of the varieties that are available in the trade. All of them are going to be very low growing. All of them can tolerate very low shade. Sometimes, you know, no sunlight at all, and you can get an Ajuga to grow. As they mature, they can start to get very tight. You might have some disease problems where the centers start to melt out with maybe a fungal issue. So you do want to provide good air circulation, and if that happens, you want to thin them out. I go in and I'll just kind of scoop out parts of them, sections of them, so that they now have room to expand, and I don't seem to have the fungal issues. It's primarily used as a ground cover. It does well on banks, on slopes, under trees, around shrubs. Can also do well with some of our early spring blooming bulbs planted underneath it, such as snowdrops, which is galanthus. According to Missouri Botanic Gardens, rabbit and deer they don't bother it, and it's tolerant of black walnut. The anemones, I'm concentrating today on more of the fall blooming anemones. There's many anemones out there. Anemone gets its name from the Greek anemos, meaning wind. And again, following Alan Armitage's research, he lists the 4 fall blooming types as X. hybrida, tomentosa, hupahensis, and vitifolia. Now, some of you might have been dealing with anemones in the past that tend to get very thuggish. They can really take over. Robotissima is one that, once established, it has a free-range mentality. Just will go wherever. So you might want to do your research and visit gardens and talk to gardeners and find out which ones are doing well for them. I'm showing you 2 that I have in my garden. The little pink one is Hupahensis variety japonica Little Princess. This is a clump former, and it only reaches about 1.5 to 2 feet tall. So if you're looking for something shorter, do your research, and they're introducing more and more. The one on your right is Honorine Jobert. Beautiful fall blooming anemone, pure white with that yellow eye, and this was the 2016 Perennial Plant of the Year. Honorine Jobert, that's going to get upwards of about, in my garden, about 3.5 feet tall. The Aricenas, not a popular plant, but they're out there, they're available. They're naturally found where in the wild, they're going to be in a moist area near waterfalls or where water is running or splashing. So a moist site, mimic what they're receiving in nature. They have these 3 fairly large radiating leaves from the top, and then the flower is usually got that curved space over the top, hidden beneath. Flowers spring into summer. And oftentimes, later in the season, your flower will be replaced by an attractive seed head. It could be anything from a black to a blackish blue to a reddish color like you see in the lower right corner. I have Aracema draconitum, which is the green dragon. These all are members of the Arum family, and they're all considered to be poisonous. So if that's something that you're worried about, then Arums, you need to do your research on those. Now this is Arum italicum pictum, and I'm really very curious about this plant. I planted this, 20 years ago, and it was not supposed to be listed as hardy for my area. We usually get, on average, so I'm minus 15-ish around, and it was not supposed to survive. So I planted it and said, I'm just going to grow it for its foliage, and then after it's done blooming, as you see in the lower right, it has these green seeds which turn a brilliant orange. It's a very, very attractive plant. I have had this now for 20 years, to the point where I am pulling it out. And I did some research, and the map that I'm showing you in the upper right shows areas in the U.S. where it is starting to become invasive. And there's a couple spots, I know it's hard to see, in southern Illinois, in the St. Louis area, and there's one way up in northern Michigan. So I'm just curious if any of you have had this and if you've had similar situations. Very attractive. I love the foliage. I love the orange berry later on. They only get about 12, maybe 15 inches tall when they're in foliage. Then with that seed head, that might be about 12 inches tall. But they are spreading to the point where I'm having to take them out. Aruncus is goat's beard. This people call a stilbe on steroids because that's what it looks like. This is going to emerge early in the spring. This is a plant that's going to give you some size early in the season. Just like our baptisias, they come out, they give us a nice big background size, a good height. Aruncus will do the same. It's a native plant. It is found in moist woodlands and prefers a well-drained, moist soil. If you have it in a spot where it dries out during the summer, the foliage can look really raggy. It can start to brown out. The plant can actually start to look very, very poorly. So you want to make sure if it's getting sun that you're providing it with enough moisture, because the moisture will help it get through those hot afternoon days. The name dioicus stands for dioecious, and that tells me that there are separate male and separate female plants. The male plants are said to have the bigger, more robust flowers. So if you're looking for one, you might choose one that has more of a masculine name. The one in my garden is Horatio, and that's a male plant. The female plants, they have a nice bloom. It's just the males are supposed to have a much more robust flower to them. If they're happy, they can easily be 4 to 5+ feet tall. Tolerate rabbits, according to Missouri Botanic Gardens. There is a dwarf one. It's called a thesifolius. That's 8 to 12 inches tall, but I like the tall ones. I like to have that height in the back of my garden. The wild gingers, the acerums. This is not the culinary ginger. That's Zinzibar officinale. This gets its common name from the ginger-like smell that arises from its roots. Now, there's approximately 70 species of acerum. I'm just talking about 2 today. And when I was doing the research on this, one author reported that in 2007 they were looking through catalogs for acerums, and one catalog had 120 selections or cultivars available. So there's a lot out there. The Acerum canadense is the one on the right. This is a woodland garden that is native. It has a heart-shaped leaf that's dull and a little bit fuzzy. It has these purple flowers that are close to the ground, and again, I'll try to point them out. I have one right there. They're close to the ground. They are pollinated by beetles and ants, and you hardly notice it. You have to lift the foliage to even see it. This does make a good ground cover, but I also am curious about this because there have been reports of this starting to spread where it's not wanted, and that through reseeding or it getting transferred around by birds. So I would also be curious if any of you have had that same situation, because I know in my garden it's starting to pop up in places where I don't want it. The one on the left is the European ginger, and this is native to southern Europe. It's more of a clump former, and I think you can tell by the pictures it has similar leaf shape, but they're glossy. And when you really get into the European gingers, there are some with beautiful variegations, beautiful foliage. Slow growing. I wish it would grow a little bit faster, at least in my garden. And again, according to the Missouri Botanic Garden, deer leave this alone, and it's also tolerant of black walnut. Height, usually the European is going to be, maybe 6 inches tall, where the Canadian can easily reach upwards of 10 to 12 inches tall. A stilby, I'm sure many of you are familiar with a stilby. Tall with these plumes that come up with shades of whites and pinks and reds and corals. They really do best where they're going to get some soil moisture, and don't allow them to dry out, because if you've experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. They also, if they get too dry during the summer months, their foliage can get crispy, get kind of raggy looking. You might want to feed the soil with some compost, helps with the moisture retention. Now, depending on which one you have, there's many in the trade. You can have some that the flower spikes are only going to reach upwards of 10 inches. You can have some that are going to reach upwards to 2, 2.5, 3 feet. So when you're looking at a stilbies, look to the size that you want and look to the color that you want. Diamonds and Pearls is a pure white. I've got Key Biscayne, Vision in red. There's a small one called Sprite, and Sprite only gets about maybe 12, 15 inches in bloom. It has a very pale shell pink flower, very nice glossy foliage, and it was the perennial plant of the year in 1994. Rabbit resistant, deer resistant, tolerates shade, and according to Missouri Botanic Gardens, tolerant of black walnut also. Hardy Begonia. This is one I would say would probably do best from about southern Illinois south. Most books will list this as not being hardy to northern Illinois, and from my experience, I had it for a couple mild winters, and then we had a very cold winter without any snow, and I lost it. Full shade to part shade, well-drained soils does best if you can give it some organic material. You might consider deadheading this because this will reseed where it's comfortable. It's called Hardy Begonia, that's the name, and it's really good for if you're looking for something from mid to late summer. It mixes well with hostas and ferns, and really does well in a shady border. As I said, up in northern Illinois, you might have some challenges with this one. And again, you can grow this under black walnut. For those of you that are saying, why is she saying that? Black walnut, if you've ever dealt with walnut wilt, which is a substance the roots give off, some plants are very sensitive, and the substance will actually kill the plant. So for many people dealing with shade, you might be dealing with a walnut tree. So it's nice to know which ones are reportedly tolerant to that walnut substance. Virginia, or Pig Squeak. There's two in the trade. One is Virginia cordifolia, and the other is crassifolia. Basically, they look the same, except one reportedly has their flower held a little bit higher, and the other doesn't have a leaf petiole. It's often sold for its evergreen feature, and I sometimes question that, because in my garden, it gets pretty beat up during the winter. It's often showing bad winter damage coming into spring. I just go out and I clip it away, and then it gets these shiny, glossy, cabbage-like leaves with these rosy pink spike flowers. And for entertainment value, if you want to entertain your family and friends, it gets its name Pig Squeak, because when you reportedly rub the leaf between your thumb and forefinger, it sounds like a pig squeaking. Brunera, Siberian Bug Gloss, is another shade plant. Medium moisture, well-drained soil, can tolerate part shade, can take a little bit of sun, as long as if it gets good soil moisture. In a hot summer situation, if it does get too dry, you could see some scorching. They all have those small periwinkle, I think they look like forget-me-not flowers. I'm showing you in that center top picture. They form clumps, The one that I'm showing you on the left, it's the variegated plant in the back. That is Jack Frost. That was the perennial plant of the year in 1990. And the plant in front of that is Astrantia, if you're curious. I also have in the middle bottom picture Jack Frost up against Hecanocloa, the golden Hakone grass. There's also some yellow-leaved cultivars. I'm showing you green gold. Most of them, the foliage, I'm going to say a foot to maybe a foot and a half, but there is a new one in the trade called Alexander the Great, and it's reportedly extra large, and if you've seen it in the catalog, there's that very serious man standing behind it with his arms around it, and it's just supposed to be, 3 feet tall and the size of a bushel basket. I have it, and it hasn't gotten that large yet, but I've only had it for one season. Carex. I have a good friend, John Hoffman, who owns Hoffman Nursery, and he always says this ornamental grass-like plant never gets any respect, so he calls it the Rodney Dangerfield of the ornamental grass trade, and for those of you that are old enough, you know what I mean. It is not an ornamental grass, but it's lumped in with them. It's a sedge, and it's often overlooked. It's a grass-like plant, but if you reach down and you roll the leaf blades or the stem between your fingers, it will be triangular. Sedges have edges. There's so many that are out there. Many of them are native plants, and they offer a wonderful, wonderful texture to the garden. Easy to grow, shade perennial. Most books will list them as resistant to deer. What I'm showing you here is the Appalachian sedge, which is native to North America, usually getting about 12 inches. And if you look closely, they have these little, just very nondescript green flower type things. That's their flower that grows at the tips. There's variegated sedge. I'm showing you the ice Valet Sedge. This one, about a foot tall. It's not a native. Its origin is from Japan. But there's others in the trade. We have Silver Scepter, we have Variegata, and there's one called Silk Tassel that are all variegated. This one I like. This is Seersucker Sedge. And if you look closely, it has these unique 1-inch wide, rippled, call them dimpled, deep green textured leaves. And it really offers a different look in the shade garden. Early spring, if it blooms for you, you're going to see delicate purple blooms that will kind of float over the foliage that only gets to be about 12 inches tall. And this one is native, but I just love that texture. I just love that it's kind of a brighter green color, and it just has that seersucker texture. Chasmathium latifolium, some of you are probably moaning when I'm showing you this one. This is a clump-forming upright ornamental grass that is native. It usually is going to get about 3.5 feet tall, tolerates shade, forms these lovely pendulous drooping flower heads, which will then bleach to that very attractive kind of a mahogany tan. However, this will reseed. So if you don't want little chasmanthiums, if you want to have that ornamental look during the growing season, but you don't want to have little chasmanthiums everywhere, deadhead this plant in late fall, usually about late September, so that the seeds don't go everywhere, because they do reseed. They have a very wiry root system, and they're very difficult to remove. But for people that want to have a grass in the shade, this one is good. There's a variegated one called River Mist, and in my garden, when it's reseeded solid green, so it doesn't come true from seed. So I just picked those out, but the main plant has remained variegated. Lily of the Valley. This will rapidly spread, especially when you get from about southern Illinois, well, maybe not southern Illinois, maybe about St. Louis north, but in the southern half of the United States, it struggles. So I guess it depends on where you are, where you grew up, what your experience was with this plant, that you either find it to be an aggressive weed or something with just this welcomed, beautiful, wafting spring fragrance. It really, it's your opinion. It is really gained popularity in the commercial cut flower industry. If you've ever planned a wedding or some event where you wanted to have lily of the valley, you paid the price for it. About 8 inches tall, spring bloomer. The foliage is green all season. There's also a pale pink in the trade, and there's one that has variegated foliage. Bleeding Heart, Dicentra. Easily grown, average, well-drained soil, part shade. Doesn't like wet feet. That's where you're going to have some problems with it. I'm showing you Valentine. That was an introduction several years ago with that deeper red heart-shaped flower with the white center. The common is the one that I show you in the upper right, which is Dicentra spectabilis. And the one on the bottom is Gold Heart. And Gold Heart, I just find is a showstopper. Bright gold, and then these beautiful pink blossoms. Mobot lists Dicentras very high. They give them a rating of 5 out of 5. There's also a fringed bleeding heart, which has variegated foliage. That Gold Heart, if you can see in the picture, it's fronted with a Bethlehem sage. That's the blue that's flowered. That's in my garden. And we'll be talking about Bethlehem sage in a minute. Digitalis. Digitalis species, or foxglove. The name Digitalis means finger-like. And it was interesting when I did the research. They're called finger flowers because they are like unto the fingers of a glove with the tips cut off. And I thought, that sounds right. There are annual Digitalis, there are perennial Digitalis, and there are biennial Digitalis. So do your research and know which one you have. They all do well in shade. And the taller ones are really going to add that dramatic interest to your garden. These should be starting to come into bloom, usually for me, in about June. I also have a lutea, Digitalis lutea, which is the yellow Digitalis. They have nodding flowers, but they're much smaller and more numerous, so the flower stalk is more narrow, but a very nice plant. Then you have grandiflora, which those flowers are actually 2 to 2.5 inches long and drooping. So there's a wide variety of Digitalis. You can have some that will reach a foot tall. You'll have others that can reach up to 3.5 feet tall. Epimediums. This is Berrinwort, and when it first came out years and years ago, everyone said, oh, it tolerates dry shade. So I was trying it in dry shade, and I just didn't have any luck with it. Well, now, as I've done some more research, yes, it does tolerate drought, heavy shade, erosion, dry soil once it's established. So you've got to pay attention to this. Don't ignore it like I did. Got to pay attention to it. Once it's established, then you have this beautiful plant. Can tolerate competition from tree roots and can tolerate very heavy shade. There are many in the trade. There are some beautiful epimediums. I'm just showing you just a small selection of what's available. You can have yellows. I'm showing you Amber Queen, which gets about 24 inches tall. Pink Angels, just look at those delicate pink flowers, and that's only going to get about 10, maybe 12 inches tall. Then you have those with variegated foliage, and I'm showing you Mottled Madness, which will reach 15 inches tall. This one is American trout lily, but it also can be called yellow's adder tongue, yellow trout lily, yellow fawn lily, and yellow dogtooth violet. So there's many common names. It's a native spring wildflower, moist woodlands. and it sends up this nodding bell or lily-shaped yellow flower atop a naked scape, and then at the base of the plant you have two basal leaves that form at the bottom. Flowers reach about 12 inches. It's a corm that you purchase and you plant in the fall, and they will slowly form colonies. But this is a spring ephemeral, so it will die down. It's tolerant all the way up into Wisconsin. Ferns, there's so many ferns that are out there. I'm showing you one of my favorites. This is the northern maidenhair fern. I just love the light green, the delicate texture to this plant. And it's going to get about 24 inches tall. There's also a dwarf. This one is the Himalayan maidenhair fern, and reportedly is only going to get between 6 to 10 inches tall. Then we have the lady ferns, the ethereums. The pictum, which you see in the upper left, was the perennial plant of the year in 2004. Then there's many types, and a lot of these ferns, they're going to show you your best visual display with the new growth in the spring. So I'm showing you Ursula's red, which gives you that nice red. Then they kind of fade to more of a reddish green plum during the summer. But every time a new flush comes out, you see that color. Burgundy lace is another nice purple. One that I'm not showing you is another favorite, and that's autumn fern brilliance, Dryopteris, because its new growth comes out a coppery red-orange. Geraniums. There's lots of geraniums that can take partial shade. There's about 300 species of geraniums. Roseanne is the one on the upper right. This was a perennial plant of the year with its very floriferous, kind of a periwinkle blue flower. The one on the left is a big mouthful. It's Biokovo is the cultivar name. This was also a perennial plant of the year. This one I have had in my garden for years, and it just keeps coming back. Has these pale white-pink flowers which have these dark pink stamens. And then as the flowers close back up, you have kind of this red, seed head that forms. Most of your geraniums are going to be about 12 inches tall. This is a new one for me, and I just planted this last year. This is Indian Psychic. This is Galenia. It is native to northeast U.S. It's going to reach 3 feet by 3 feet. Some kind called Bowman's root. It's an upright clump-forming plant. It's going to offer this very star-like white flower, and it's held up high on red stems. And then after the petals drop, you have red calyces. I have been growing this now. It's coming back for me this year. I saw it in some gardens last summer. It was just stunning. Sometimes the common name is ipecac, and because syrup of ipecac was used to reduce vomiting for food poisoning, but that's really a Brazilian shrub. But what I found is that the Galenia, according to American Indians, supposedly was supposed to have a similar effect. And it's a member of the rose family. Yes, and I saw Kari put this in. Yes, Kari, this is one of my favorites, Hecanocloa macra Aureola, another mouthful. I really like this grass. Moist, well-drained soils can tolerate shade, part shade to deep shade. It spreads by an underground rhizome. I wish mine would spread faster. And there's the one I'm showing you here is Aureola, which was the perennial plant of the year, which has the yellow-green stripe down it. There's one called All Gold, and that has no green stripe, and there's also one that now has some red tinge to it. Works great with Hosta. There you're seeing it in my garden with Hosta and Spigelia, the red bloomer. Height, it's going to kind of mound out towards you, so I usually put this at about 15 to 20 inches tall. But if you take one of those blades and were actually to measure it, to straighten it out and measure it, it could easily reach 2 feet plus. But very nice grass for the shade. Give it time. It's slow to establish. The hellebores, I'm sure many of you have hellebores in your garden. These tolerate shade. They emerge very early in the spring. In fact, mine are just getting toward the end of their bloom. This was the perennial plant of the year in 2005. Pick a color. There's so many that are out there. The one that I particularly like is the amber gem that I'm showing you in the lower right-hand corner. Depending on which one you have, most of them are going to have semi-evergreen foliage that the plant itself is going to reach anywhere from 12 to about 18 inches tall. The other characteristic that's desirable is that deer leave this one alone. The heucheras, another huge group, and there are so many that have come out. I looked in one catalog and there were 72 cultivars just of heuchera listed. This was Palace Purple. This one came out in 1991, and it really started the heuchera madness because breeders really grabbed onto this plant. And over the years, you know, there's been so many introductions, big leaf, small leafed, pick a color leaf, different colored flowers. Majority of them are going to be clump formers. Majority of them will form a mound anywhere from 10 to 15 inches tall, and then pick your foliage color. The latest introductions are those that have the Velosa strain in them. For some of you in the south, maybe your corabels, maybe you're too humid, your soils are too wet, and you've been having some difficulty with them. Though the ones that have the Velosa strain in them have proven to be more tolerant of high humidity and moist situations. The three I'm showing you here are all Velosa strains. The top one is Caramel, beautiful plant, peachy orange on top, and then underneath the leaves tend to be more of a plum purple, about 12 inches tall. Georgia Peach, about 14 inches tall. Georgia Peach is going to have white flowers, and I'm trying to think what my Caramel has. I think it has a whitish flower, if I'm remembering correctly. I love the foliage. Delta Dawn is a fairly new introduction, and it has the variegated foliage to it. They are kind of a chartreuse in summer, and then as the temperatures cool in the fall, the leaf veins will turn this bright red color. And then as the season progresses into cooler temperatures, the leaf will turn a complete bronze, about 12 inches tall. Kringashoma, this is another one that maybe you aren't familiar with. Kringashoma palmata is the yellow wax bell. It's a shrubby, somewhat shrubby herbaceous perennial. It has these erect, tall stems that are typically purplish. They have a foliage that is maple leaf-like. It can get to be 3 to 4.5 feet tall. And then it's going to have these narrow, drooping, waxy, bell-shaped yellow flowers. Usually late summer for me. Usually this is going to be blooming in about August for me. And it definitely needs a moist soil and shade. If it gets too sunny and dry, it can turn very crispy on you. So it's not tolerant of drought, but it really is a very nice showstopper plant, and that's yellow wax bells. Lamium, some of you are familiar with lamiums. I'm showing you beacon silver on the upper right and aureum on the lower. These are the low creeping lamiums that just creep along the ground. We have white flowering, we have purple flowering, we've got the yellow foliage. Majority of them are only going to get maybe 6 to 8 inches tall, and they can spread. But I'm showing you one on the left-hand side that you might not be familiar with. This is Lamium orvala. This is a clump-forming lamium that's in my garden. It's been growing under a crabapple tree. It's blooming right now, and it's about 18 inches tall. It will bloom probably for another month, and then it just stays with this very nice clump of tall green foliage. I've had it now for 3 years. It has not spread. It has stayed in a clump. So if you're looking for something different in lamiums, you might want to try orvala. Lysomachia, you again might be moaning with this, but it is a plant that can tolerate shade. The reason people would be moaning is that it can spread. But if you've got a spot that's maybe landlocked, maybe it's got a sidewalk up against a building, the clethroides or the gooseneck loosestrife can do very well. The one that I'm showing you on the right is the ground cover, Nummularia aurea, and it does offer a really nice yellow creeping ground cover. It will spread. It's very shallow rooted. I just let it kind of creep in. You see it in my garden, just kind of creep under my hostas and some of my other plants because I really like the contrast. Okay, this is my latest obsession, and these are Martagon lilies. I was on a garden tour last summer and just fell in love with the Martagon lilies that I saw, and then I went on a garden tour up in Minnesota, and they grow wonderfully in Minnesota, so I thought, okay, they can grow for us here in Illinois. They are considered a late spring, summer blooming lily. Part shade. They can't take full heavy shade, but they can take part shade. And they have the nodding flowers that cascade down. These are ones that I purchased last fall. They ship late. Don't be surprised. They can be rather pricey. But I'm showing you sunny morning with kind of those orange-yellow nodding flowers, and I'm showing you Russian morning with the pendulous burgundy flowers. Others that I have now, chameleon, gaybird, all of them are reported to be about 2 to 3 feet tall. And I have them in spots in my garden where they get about a half-day shade, half-day sun. And I'm trying them in both morning sun and morning shade. Albiflorum is white and then just a species pink. Now, how you tell a Martagon, and this isn't in your handout because I added this morning, is I hope you can see the whorled foliage. Okay, right, I'll try to point again. Okay, the plant is right there. See this stem coming up, and the foliage is whorled around the base. That tells you that it's a Martagon. And this is one that I planted. Now, other people have also told me they might not come up the first year. Don't know what they're doing, but they some of them don't. In mine, I have a few that only a couple are coming up, but I'm going to be patient. And then other people have told me they'll come up for years, and then they won't come up for a year. But then the following year, they're back up. So they seem to have a mind of their own. But it's one of my new obsessions that I've been adding to my garden. Mazes. This one is definitely for southern Illinois. I can't grow this, but I put this in. It's a low-growing ground cover, usually only about 2 inches tall, because I saw this growing in southern Illinois, and I said, what is it? Cold hardy to zone 6. Some books say possibly zone 5, but it's going to form this dense carpet, nice green, and then these purplish tubular tulip flowers with yellow and white markings. Missouri Botanic Garden rates it very high, 4.5 out of 5, and actually awarded it its Plant of Merit status. So those of you that can grow it, you're looking for something as a ground cover in the shade, you might want to try this. Mertensia virginica. This is another spring ephemeral. It's going to die back in the summer. It comes up early. It has these nodding purple flowers. Does very well in a woodland setting. In bloom, it's going to be about 18 inches tall. Here I'm going to show you 2 plants. This is Muckdenia. Muckdenia has these maple-like leaves, smooth, has these clusters of small white flowers that come out, and a phenomenal fall color. Only gets maybe 10 inches tall. My clump is maybe 10 inches by about 12 inches. Had this in my garden for many years. It does not get any sun at all. It's a bright area, but it really is a nice plant if you're looking for something shiny leaf, no sunlight, and a nice flower. Then last year I noticed there was Muckgenia. And Muckgenia is they crossed Muckdenia with Virginia. Remember, Virginia was, we saw that earlier, was the Pig Squeak. And they came up with Crimson Fans. Crimson Fans, again, is going to only get to 8 to 10 inches tall. It can form a nice clump getting up to upwards of 20 inches. And its flowers are reportedly to be fuchsia. I planted this last year. I have not seen it in bloom yet. It has the same shiny textured leaf and really good fall color. This is Solomon Seal. This is Solomon Seal, the variegated that I'm showing you. This was a perennial plant of the year in 2013. This thing can grow anywhere. It can tolerate shade, dry, wet. It has a rhizome, and it will spread, and it's not a deep-rooted plant, so it's fairly easy to remove where you don't want it. The polygonatum name, poly is many, and the GONU part of that means knee joints. And when you look at members of this genus, it talks about the many joints, not only in the rhizome, but also some of their stems tend to be somewhat jointed. So this one, about 18 to 24 inches tall. It gets the pendulous white flowers, gets a nice blue-black berry. I mean, if you're looking for something that you want to try in a tough situation, I would try this, because it really is a tough plant. But did you know that there's many others in the trade? Look at some of these. I mean, look at Angel Wing. Look at Fireworks. Look at that curly-leafed one called Krug. Angel Wing, about 18 inches tall. Fireworks is taller, it's about 24 inches, but Krug is going to stay low, about 12 inches. And there's more in the trade. There's approximately 60 species. I know Plant Delight's nursery, just in their catalog alone, had 12 different types, all of them to do well in the shade. Pulmonaria is lungwort. And there's several. I showed you the one, if you remember the slide, with the golden dicentro, the bleeding heart. And I told you it was fronted by a Bethlehem sage. That was Mrs. Moon, the one that I have in the upper right hand. Most are going to be a pink or a purple or blue type flower. There are some solid green leafed, but most have a variegation to them. Silver bouquet is almost a pure white and has a nice flower to it. This one, Allen Armitage, just in Bethlehem Sage, has 47 different cultivars listed, so there's a lot to choose from. It's called lungwort because years ago, I think in the 1500s, they would name plants by the outward appearance, and the spotted leaves of Pulmonaria reminded them of diseased lungs. So that's where it gets its name, lungwort. I do deadhead mine after blooming. I cut the flowers off. They tend to get heavy and flop to the ground and leave the foliage for the rest of the season. Most of them are going to stay under 12 inches tall when the foliage. Regersias, I really like Regersias. I am trying some, and I hope they take, because once you have an established clump, they are just amazing. Big, bold foliage topped with flowering spikes. There's two in the trade primarily. One is Podophylla, and that's the bronze one I'm showing you. That's Fireworks up in the upper right. And that one has 5 leaflets to it, versus the Esculifolia, which is the finger leaf Regersia, which has 7 leaflets. But other than that, they grow virtually the same. They like moist situations. They don't like to dry out. They can tolerate shade. They have big, bold foliage. In bloom, they can easily reach 3, 4, 5 feet tall. And here were just a couple that I took last year at a garden I was visiting. Just stunning. Different colored foliage, different colored flowers. This one, Rhodia, this is an interesting plant, and maybe some of you have tried this. This is an evergreen plant. It's glossy green. It's an uncommon evergreen perennial. It's one of the, and they say it's one of the most overlooked hardy foliage plants available. Well, I got it and killed it. So that tells you, I guess, that something about my gardening skills. Has these long strap-like evergreen leaves, and they form a clump that increases slowly. I have seen beautiful clumps of this down in the St. Louis area. It's supposedly hardy all the way up to Wisconsin. Rutgers, which is in New Jersey, their average cold temperatures can easily get down to -15. They had it as their plant of the year in 2013. It tolerates dry shade. It has a berry that forms in the center of the foliage that's very attractive. There's some variegated ones that just give you that color all season, but they can be rather expensive. So if you're looking at these, maybe you have a friend that you can get one from, or if you try one, I would just try one at first, because like I said, mine didn't take, and I had it in dry shade, and it's supposed to be tolerant all the way up to Wisconsin. Generally about 15 inches tall. Silene is bladder campion. This is a huge genus, the Silene group. This is a Minnesota wildflower that they say blooms June through October, so if it's blooming up there in Minnesota, it should tolerate us. 24 inches tall, and it has this bloated calyx. That's it's not the petals, it's the sepals that form this bloated calyx, that kind of reddish white mottled portion of the flower, which really is an attractive feature. Very nice plant. Now this is lichness, which some people confuse with a member of Silene, so sometimes these are listed both ways. This one can tolerate some shade, does not like wet soils though, so you could try this in some dry shade. Can reach anywhere from 18 to 20 inches tall. Has this beautiful fuchsia color. It comes in white, it comes in a light pink, but it does reseed. So it could reseed for you, but the plant itself is often considered a short-lived perennial. Spigelia is Indian pink. Love this plant. Late spring, early summer, it has these unusual, beautiful red flowers with yellow throats they're just stunning. 24 to 30 inches tall, native. I have this in my garden. In fact, the picture in the upper left is in my garden. Just love this plant for its unusual flower. Use it with Hosta. I have it up against the Hecanacloa. Use it with ferns. It would do very well. Usually, like I said, 24 to 30 inches tall. Tiarella, foam flower. This is a plant that really needs moist soils in the summer, moisture retentive soils, not wet, but don't let it get wet in the winter. You know, some plants, as we get through the winter, going into spring, especially after we've had rains like we've had, we have very wet soils. That can really be fatal to some of your tiarellas. Shade loving, it's a native to the eastern United States and Canada. Depending on which one you have, there's several in the trade. In bloom can reach maybe 10 inches, some can push up to 20 inches, and some have some very interesting foliage. You might be familiar with a plant called heucherella, and heucherella is a cross between the coral bells, heuchera, and foam flower, which is tiarella. And that's where they get the name heucherella. And they are also shade-tolerant plants. Tricertis toad lily, kind of an interesting plant. Good for shade. They bloom in the fall, which is nice if you're looking for something in fall. But the majority of the flowers are going to be purplish or purple with a little bit of pink to them. It's more of a novelty. Some of them have nice foliage. I'm showing you lightning strike on the bottom. They reportedly do better in central to southern Illinois. I've had one in my garden now for many, many years, and it's just doing fine. It gets its name, it gets its name toad lily. You know, people always tell you don't handle toads, and why? Because you would get warts. Well, take a toad lily flower, turn it over, and you will see 3 little wart-like growths, and that's where it gets its common name, toad lily. And the one I'm showing you there, the Siriu, gets about 2 feet tall. Trillium, a great flower blooming in my garden now. Many are native to the U.S. All species bear a single stem with these 3 whorled leaves and a solitary flower. Each flower has 3 leaf-like sepals and then 6 stamens. And there's generally 2 groups. There's one that has a flowering stalk That's the pedunculate group. And then there are those that don't have a flower stalk. They're sessile, and so they bloom very low to the ground. Some of them have beautiful foliage. There's deep reds, there's yellows, there's many different types. Again, depending on which one you have, it could be anywhere from 6 inches tall up to 15 inches tall. This one, Uvularia, this is large-flowered bellwort. This is a native wildflower, clump-forming, grows to about 2 feet tall. And what's unusual, it has these long, about 1.5 inch pendulous, somewhat bell-shaped yellow flowers with these twisting petals. Well, they're actually called tepals. It's just a petal and sepal look alike. And the Uvularia, that name comes from the uvula that hangs in the back of your throat. Y'all know what I'm talking about? That's what they named this plant after, Uvularia, that hangs down from the soft palate near the back of your throat. It's easily grown, well-drained soils, stays through the summer. It's not a spring ephemeral. It forms a seed. Alan Armitage highly, highly rates this. I was just reading what he had written about it. He really rates this high, as does the Missouri Botanic Garden. Vinca. This is Vinca minor. We also have Vinca major. Periwinkle tolerates shade. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it as a ground cover. Trailing stems with evergreen foliage, and then the periwinkle blue flowers. You know, some people are tired of it, but you know what? It's tolerant of heavy shade, drought. Deer tend to leave it alone. It can take dry soils. You know, it's really a tough plant. Only going to get about 6 inches tall. So I'm going to finish with one that maybe you're familiar with, and this is Chelone, or pink turtlehead. Rich, moist soils, partial shade. Mine blooms in late August into September. Roughly about 2.5 feet tall. It is a native, and if you look at that flower, squint your eyes, and the flower is supposed to resemble a turtle's head. So that is your extra credit plant for today. I hope I've intrigued you on some maybe new and interesting plants for your shade garden. And I've been looking like there really aren't a lot of questions, just a lot of comments on what people have liked. Any questions?
Kathy Pittman, I'm jealous that you have a huge Regersea. Well, I'll stay on for a little bit. If there's no questions, or put them in the chat room, you have my contact information. You can reach me at any time. But I'll stay on for a little bit. If you need to go, that's fine. Have a good day. Any plants that are hummingbird friendly for the shade? Well, anything that would have that tubular flower. I have them visiting my coral bells when they're in bloom, because they have that small tubular flower. I'm trying to think what else I've seen them visit in my shade garden. I'd have to think about that, because most of the plants are going to be sun, but they have been to my coral bells when they're in bloom. thank you. And as you all know, you can view review this program and all of our other programs at our 4-season gardening series section on YouTube.